President Bola Tinubu yesterday celebrated his first May Day as president, assuring the organized labor that the issues that prevented the tripartite committee on minimum wage from reaching a consensus would soon be resolved and that workers' days of worries over their living wage would be gone. The president, who spoke while delivering his speech as special guest of honor at this year's May Day commemoration ceremony at the Eagle Square, Abuja, also assured workers that his administration was open to the tripartite committee's living wage above minimum wage. Tinubu, who was represented at the ceremony by Vice President Kashim Shettima, with a message titled "Solidarity in Action, Collaborative Governance, Empowered Workers," called on Labour to collaborate with his administration in its efforts to achieve growth and development for Nigeria. But the Nigeria Labour Congress, NLC, and Trade Union Congress, TUC, have said they would not guarantee industrial peace if government failed to conclude negotiations on new minimum wage by the end of May this year. Well, I mean, just looking at that, yesterday, it was May Day, of course, we looked forward to the statements, or we've seen the statements released by both NLC, TUC, Organized Labour, and the response by the president there, represented by his vice.
So I think a lot of things the NLC said are things that centered around the welfare of workers, and it was broad-ranging, holistic, talking in general terms about the welfare, productivity value of the Nigerian worker, how to really take care of the Nigerian worker, also the sundry economic challenges and sundry economic issues, the fact that we've been inundated with a lot of inflation at the start of the year, and also the fact that it is very difficult to get by. Take, for instance, a stat that says 101% of the basic of a Nigerian worker is spent on food as we speak today, which is a sad reality. I'm not even factoring the healthcare costs, the malaise everywhere. Most of the hitherto requests they made, as regards even subsidy removal, the ensuring that the refineries are working, the promise, that they got in December that refineries are going to start working, but we know the political game we are playing in the Port Harcourt refinery. They are saying mechanical completion and all of that, and all the gamut of government talk. And as at today, nothing has been done. We are just talking about deploying CNG buses and all of that. Then they came to substantive issues as regards wage, which a tripartite committee has been talking about, which is also in tandem with reviewing of the wage laws hitherto. Some states have led the way, as regards, starting all of this. Edo State, most remarkably, we can't commend Governor Obaseki enough because it's not always easy, to do that. And these conversations are on. They've also gone ahead to reject this 35% because the 35% are just add-ons. So it doesn't really address the substantive issue of the minimum wage in the country. So when you say, okay, a 35% increase based on what threshold? It's 35% increase of the basic. Is it in tandem with reality? Dr. Abati talks about this triple lock system we do that is at parity with inflation in the UK, for instance, as regards, pension earnings and things like that. So Labour is asking for a wage that is at parity also with inflation and the current reality and all of that. But to also talk about the inflation conversation, we need to have sustainable conversations. And that's where I disagree with Labour. We cannot, in good conscience, talk about 615,000 minimum wage at a time where productive capacity of a country is slumping. We cannot deceive ourselves. Last month, 1.2 million barrels was churned out according to OPEC quota, without condensate anyway, which we all know condensate is light crude and all of that. And we go through the gamut and we make money from condensate. I mean, if you remember when we started looking at condensate big time, the Oso condensate field and all of that. But 615,000 for a time that revenue is depressed in the country, for a time that the private sector is not even getting any leeway or getting anything any better, is something that might not probably work. So Labour should also reconsider and also be amenable to more negotiations when the tripartite committee finally comes out with their reports so that we can have a full adoption of the process. I think that's practical. They also, Labour, in Labour's way, is also saying, by the end of the month, if nothing is done, they're going to threaten a strike and all of that. But let us be realistic in this conversation. Happy May Day.
Dr. Bati.
Okay, yesterday was May Day. What we're dealing with today is the fallout. The president was the special guest of honor at the Eagle Square yesterday in Abuja, and it was represented by Vice President Senator Kashim Shettima. And the theme of the presentation by the president there was about collaborative action, empowerment of workers. And the main substance that we need to pay attention to is, the key messages by the president. He was talking about solidarity in action, he said, through the vice president who was there, who wore the same Ashwebi family attire, with the labor leaders. And the president was saying, look, for us to generate economic growth, for us to move this country forward, the two of us, government and labor, will have to work together. And I think that on that score, President Tinubu said the right thing. What can he do without the support of labor? And he went further through the vice president to acknowledge the contributions of labor to national development, the resilience of the Nigerian worker, the spirit of the Nigerian worker. And that includes all of us in this space, including those people who keep disturbing me, from the back end, from the gallery. All of us are in this together. This system can only work when there's proper collaboration at all levels. And I think that was an intelligent statement to make. Secondly, the president made the point that the tripartite committee, will deliver a living wage, that there are issues that still have to be resolved. Now, the last National Minimum Wage Act expired on April 17. And we were told that on May 1, the president would unfold a new package for the Nigerian worker. Now, what kind of crisis do they have that the tripartite members of that committee could not meet the deadline? Is it the disagreement over 615,000? Is it what exactly? We don't know the exact details. Maybe when we meet with the labor leaders who are coming on the program today, they will tell us what exactly the problem is. That's another issue. Third, the president promised organized labor living wage. Now, living wage is a political thing. It's just political talk, because first, we've been talking about wage indexation. Inflation rate is at 33.20%. Okay, because inflation has gone up, food inflation is even higher than headline inflation. You then say, okay, to cushion the effect of, stagflation, where Nigeria has found itself, stagflation means slow growth, increased prices, and then you try to hedge the bets. Now, what exactly is the government proposing as living wage? The president also left that hanging. So I think the devil really is in the details, but they've had their May Day, and Labour has said they've given a deadline of May 31st for all of these issues about living wage, minimum wage to be resolved, failing which Labour will have no option but to go onto the streets. Across the states, yes, you have many of the state governments, also making promises, praising Labour, all these praises for the Nigerian worker. That's just rhetoric. What the Nigerian worker is interested in is, opportunities, respect for their dignity. I hope that is clear. In Anambra State, I think the story is that Governor Soludo didn't show up, and that there were complaints about him not showing up well. Well, my Professor Charles Soludo, you should have known better, but you never know. Whether there are extenuating circumstances that made it impossible for him to show up. But whatever it is, I'm sure he should find a way of explaining that to organized labor. Now the opposition took the opportunity of May Day to play their own politics. Debo Ologunagba, the spokesperson for PDP, issued a statement praising workers, but somewhere inside that statement, he said, look, Nigerian workers should resist anti-people tendencies of the Tinubu administration. Well, I think that was a bit overboard. You can just talk about the workers, talk about conditions in the country, but to tell them to resist the government, maybe not. maybe not. But in any case, that's politics, and that's the way politics goes.
All right, well, 615,000 naira, that is what the organized labor is asking for in terms of living wage, which President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has assured and given hope to workers in Nigeria. Renewed Hope speech, I called that yesterday, because it was based on promises. It would have been nice to have something concrete on ground in terms of an agreement with regards to the new minimum wage. But unfortunately, as he mentioned through the vice president, they were not able to reach an agreement at the last tripartite committee meeting. However, they said that they will look into this further and come up with a figure. But he also said that, don't worry, we're going to give you a living wage. And the difference is that a living wage is able to meet at least the minimum standard of living for the Nigerian worker. Currently, if you look at the minimum wage at 30,000 naira minimum at the basic level, and you look at that side by side, what you're able, the purchasing power of that, it is next to nothing. It's almost as if you're not earning. Or as organized labor has stated in their speech, it is living and borrowing to make ends meet. And so what the president is saying is that they'll put into consideration, inflation levels, price of goods. So at least every worker with the amount of money that he takes home each month is able to afford the basics: food, shelter, and food and shelter and clothing. Now, what they said now in countenance to that labor, they said the amount of money based on well thought out and calculated metrics is 615,000 naira for a living wage that would make sense. And this brings a lot of questions up. How realistic is this? How many organizations in terms of the private sector can afford to pay this? How many state governors can afford to pay this? Because at 30,000 naira minimum, there are still some states that are owing workers' salary and there's a backlog. In fact, some people have just had to recently clear that backlog. So how realistic is this? And would this not mean that would, number one, the effect on inflation, rising inflation. Number two, the effect on salaries being owed. So on paper, you have that increase, but in principle, no one is able to pay. So you're worse for the wear at the end of the day. What they've said they put into consideration, and if you look at their arguments, it makes a bit of sense. And yesterday when we had the representative from Lagos State, NLC Lagos State, he did mention that he looked at things around a family of 2 adults, 4 children, the cost of their rent per annum, the cost of food for all 6 of them, the cost of clothing, shelter. And when you think about how much goods and services have increased, then you would kind of understand where they're coming from. But as they said, it is their own, they brought their amount to the table. It's then time for negotiations. And what the Nigerian worker is looking forward to is to hope that Renewed Hope will ensure that that amount is settled before the end of the month. Because whilst this back and forth is going on, people are still suffering. And that's why in their May Day message yesterday, organized labor highlighted the fact that at the heart of government's policies must be the people. People-centered policies. And yesterday when we were looking at Mr. Peter Obi's reaction to the Lagos-Calabar Coastal Highway, they talked about policies must be driven by compassion as well. Yes, it's important to want to get things right, put infrastructure, but the people must be at the heart so that when policies are being crafted or being implemented, there would be an estimation or an assessment of how bad or how good it would affect the people. So yes, we want to do good things to ensure that the country moves forward, but in the process of that, not to stifle or kill the Nigerian worker or even businesses that would employ the Nigerian worker. But like we've said, we have a conversation later on with organized labor, so we hope to get even more detail as to how they arrived at the living wage and how optimistic that this will be agreed to. We'll move on to our next story this morning. The Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, NUPRC, is moving to speed up the conclusion of regulatory oversight on the ongoing oil assets divestment by international oil companies, IOCs, this they learned yesterday. With the process now fully expedited, it was gathered that when concluded, Nigeria would add at least 700,000 barrels per day to its current daily production volume to hit about 2 million barrels per day before the end of the year. Many of the new investors, mostly indigenous businessmen that are taking over the multi-billion-dollar facilities, are already waiting in the wings, but had been delayed in a bid to ensure strict adherence to the rules as provided by the Petroleum Industry Act. The NUPRC also insists that all interested parties to the joint ventures must amicably resolve their differences before it can perform its regulatory function as provided by the new law. Okay, so we're looking at 2 million barrels per day before the end of 2024. Dr. Batsi, you're chuckling, but we'll come to your commentary. Rufai, your take on the story.
So that will be incumbent on how we can quickly remove the bureaucratic bottleneck. Because if you look at what is happening, there's a lot of bottleneck. I think it was the mobile deal that first raised the red flag, where they said, okay, there are other parties in it in the JV. So you had to clear with the other party, and the bureaucratic, entanglement went on for a while. I mean, there are many other deals that have been signed that we're looking at. Take, for instance, the Equinor deal, where Equinor is trying to divest and get out of the water. They've got about 58% equity in that field. But because of the bureaucratic bottleneck, because most of these contracts are pretty much, joint ventures and things like that, and you have anyway other interests, because somebody cannot entirely farm an entire field, except the person wants to incur a lot of financial encumbrances. So you get other partners in. So partners that involve, government and things like that, sorting out these partnership agreements always the problem. Because the reason when we tie down all these deals, it affects our productive output capacity. I'll go back to what I was saying before, that today now, there are indications that the 1.23 million barrels we did according to our OPEC quota last month, we have even dipped further. When we see the April number, we'll be able to know whether we have dipped further or not. And that's not good for us, because when we can't meet OPEC quota, two, the benchmark of about 2 million barrels per day, we can't meet it. And when you don't churn out product, you can't get money in. And it affects your revenue downline, and it affects how you're going to run the economy and pay 15,000. And that's why I say, I'm sorry, with due respect, Labour has not been realistic with that 15,000, because where is even the money to pay for in the first place? And don't also forget, we have a lot of encumbrances. In the spirit of defending our currency, we went out on a wild goose chase by bopping up yield rates for our bond. Today, we have a downline of about 1 trillion that we have to pay from those yield rates, because we are getting a lot of the hot money and liquidity into our forex market. So those are the problems. So if we can sort out this regulatory bottleneck, like the end of PRC is saying, then how quickly can we get these deals back on track and get them working? Because there are lots of pending deals. I mean, there's the deal that Chapal tried to buy, because we keep getting the announcements and people can't get on the field. And also there was a talk about, the exit cost on the community, cost on also understanding the environmental impact assessment, on this community, other attendant costs as regards, what makes up a well. And because we need these deals to activate quickly, because most of the wells are already moribund. I mean, we saw the incident with the former wellhead. I think the one Seplar just took over, that the Christmas tree burst open and was spreading out a lot of oil. Because if you don't clear all of these encumbrances, how do you make due investments? The reason why we're not producing and meeting our quota, because we've not had major investment in these sectors. Most of the fields need to be reinvested. We need to look at new possibilities across the field. And that's why we're not even getting the proper FDI we need. So it's a right step in the right direction, and kudos to him that is working as regards. But also the companies too should clear out their encumbrances and their fight, and let's clear out this oil sector so that investment can come in.
Okay, what are the big issues in this subject? The last time we discussed this subject was when Anikin Lopobiri, Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, boasted that Nigeria was going to produce 8 million barrels, within a short space and all of that. And we raised the question on this table that, look, the Minister of State for Petroleum was just talking, and that what he was saying was not based on facts. And I specifically raised the issue that the Upstream Regulatory Commission, led by Gbenga Komolafe, will need to call some of these parties, indigenous parties, taking over from these decommissioning, abandoning partners to the joint ventures, and see how these issues can be resolved so that the productivity within that sector can rise. Now, first, let me commend the Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission for listening to our advice, or for maybe they've been planning, and what we have seen is the fructification of what they had been working on, both ways. What is important is that on Monday, Gbenga Komalafe's NUPRC met with Shell. Shell had also divested and was looking at, I think, to Renaissance, which is an indigenous company. And it was on that occasion that he stated one principle he talked about free entry, free exit. Now, Shell is divesting its onshore business assets through the SPDC. And he says, well, the principle of, free entry, free exit is important. I will query that later. I don't particularly agree, but even if theoretically it makes sense. But he then went further to talk about a framework for divestment. He tied that to that principle that he established. And his point is that, yes, you may want to divest, but we must be sure that the divestment was follows certain principles: technical capacity, financial capability. The people involved must be fit and proper persons. The commitment to settle existing obligations so that you don't hand over unnecessary liabilities. Labor relations issues. And then he talked about host community trust and environmental issues. I think on the surface of it, these are not, issues that you can argue about. And then, of course, within the framework that he has designed, you have Shell divesting, you have ExxonMobil having issues with the Seplat divestment. In their own regard, it was NMPCL saying that under the PIA, they have the right of first refusal. And Komolafe has been quoted as saying, look, both the people divesting and the people who are going to take over, they should resolve their differences. And it's when they resolve their differences that we can have the outcome of 700,000 barrels per day. There is also the Eni Wando matter. There is that is sale of Ajipoi, OML 60 to 63, and then you have Total Energies also divesting. So what the NUPRC is trying to do, in my view, is to establish some kind of framework for resolving the problem to move the country forward. But the question that I would like to ask Gbenga Komolafe is that, look, all these multinationals, they are divesting. One of the reasons that they have given is difficulty in terms of operating in the Niger Delta. Okay, can Nigeria address that so that other countries don't benefit what we are not benefiting? Because people are running away from Nigeria. Those IOCs, as they are called, they have more technical capacity than all these indigenous companies that are taking over. But I like the point that he made about audit. He says that there will be a proper audit. Well, that proper audit should be that, those liabilities do not overburden the people that are taking over. But I feel concerned by the fact that, these IOCs, they see that Nigeria is a very difficult operating environment for them. And they see, many of them see that if they operate onshore, you have all these Niger Delta, militants, you have crude oil theft, you have all of that. In the long run, we have to address those issues if we expect to have greater profitability and greater productivity within the oil and gas sector, both onshore and offshore. But as for the indigenous companies that are taking over, yeah, it's good also for government to defend their interests, and it's good also for Gbenga Komolafe's NUPRC to be quoting the law, due process, and the provisions of the Petroleum Industry Act.
Well, Mr. Gbenga Komolafe must be applauded for his insistence on due process being followed in the era of divestment. And I think that one of the things, and it's important for him to have come out to explain in detail as to the framework that the NUPRC is developing to ensure that it's properly handled. We say this because on this table we talked about the bottlenecks or gridlock, as you may have it, with some companies who are divesting and the local companies who are looking to inherit those those investments. Now, in addition to what has already been established in terms of the breakdown of the content of that framework, two things I'd just like to center on. Number one, or maybe three things, is the health of the local organization looking to inherit, to ensure that they are financially able and have capacity to manage the investment. I think that's very important in terms of being able to check the health of that organization so that we do not see a divestment that then dies as a result of the IOCs exiting from that particular investment. The second aspect I will talk about is labor. And since yesterday was May Day and we talked about the protecting the rights and welfare of workers, I think this is quite important that the framework addresses the fact that, in fact, they talked about the certificate of settlement to be agreed by both concerned parties to ensure that matters around staff welfare, benefits, entitlements, with regards to disengagement, redundancies, retirement are properly handled. We've seen situations where matters like this would happen, and it will leave a number of workers in the lurch. A lot of people are left distressed because of the manner in which the divestment happened. So I think that was very important to have highlighted in that particular framework. Also, it looked at the impact, environmental impact, and the participation of host communities. I thought that's excellent because we've often talked about the impact of IOCs or investments like that on the environment and the long-term effect on the host communities and how this isn't looked into. So in terms of that framework, excellent. Now, the importance of this is not just to shore up in terms of the 2 million barrels per day as highlighted, which is very important because when we look at revenue and talk about generating more revenue for Nigeria, we've often talked about the potentials in crude that we haven't yet maximized as a result of us not being able to meet our quota. And this is due to a number of reasons. Of course, we've looked at oil bunkering, we've looked at lack of investment, as has been talked about. So a number of things in that regard. But in addition to that, as in terms of investment, is also being able to sanitize the industry in such a way that it would attract more investment, because the framework is not just for the protection of local investment and local organizations, but also an attraction for international investment as well. So hopefully, when this comes to life and when the bureaucracy bottlenecks are done away with, it would make it a more efficient system in terms of divestment and local organizations taking over. So we'll keep on up to date with this story in terms of how that framework would then, once the framework is developed, and see how to ensure that all organizations are able to adhere to it and it's properly implemented. Let's look at other news making the rounds this morning. Nigeria's crude oil output sank in April 2024, raising concerns that the upswing recorded in January and to some extent the second month of this year was largely unsustainable. Investors in the stock market segment of the Nigerian Exchange Limited lost about 3.6 trillion naira in April 2024 as the Central Bank of Nigeria lured investors with attractive yields on its Nigerian Treasury bills. On the foreign scene, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken hiked up pressure on Hamas on Wednesday to accept the latest proposal for a ceasefire with Israel, saying the time is now for an agreement that would free hostages and pause the nearly 7 months of war in Gaza. Just ahead of its blowout first quarter earnings report on April 25, Google laid off at least 200 employees from its core teams in a reorganization that will include moving some roles to India and Mexico.